morning, everyone, and welcome to the third of our series of talks for Archives Month. Tonight's speaker is Kathleen Seale. She is a senior archivist with the State Historical Society of Missouri at the Rolla Research Center, and that is located here in the basement of this building. She holds a master's degree in history from Oklahoma State University and has worked for the Society for over 5 years. And tonight she's going to be telling us about one of the pioneering women dentists in our area. Take it away, Katie.
Debbie and I both got the memo for the floral masks. Everybody else did? So yeah, as Debbie mentioned, I'll be talking about Dr. Minnie Pinto. So as far as I can determine, she was the first female dentist for the town of St. James, which if nobody knows where that's at, hopefully everyone in the room does. It's just up the road on 44 on your way to St. Louis. So first I'm going to talk a little bit background information as far as females in the field of dentistry. You have females back in the dental work by the mid-19th century. You really start seeing them kind of starting to crop up. Here in the U.S., you had one, Emmeline Roberts Jones, in 1855. She becomes the first, at least to our knowledge, woman to practice dentistry. She actually kind of self-taught herself. Her husband, Daniel Jones, was a dentist. He'd been in practice for a number of years, so kind of through observation and then working, not necessarily working with him, but observing him, she taught herself. So I don't know that that's really a plus. I mean, it really shows her gumption, but at the same time, a little leery. The interesting thing about her is not only did she, in 1855, go into practice with her husband at that time period, after his death, she continued the practice even without him, which is kind of unique for that time period. She mostly worked with women and children, patients at that time period, which again was very common for female dentists early on. They most often worked with women patients or children. As far as the first to receive a degree, the honor goes to Lucy Hobbs Taylor in 1866 in Ohio. She actually gets married in 1867 and convinces her husband to join her in the dentistry field, and the two of them go into practice together. Again, this is a very common trend. Usually the female dentist, whoever she might be, is in practice with a male family member, which is kind of where Minnie stands out a little bit, as she's a single female throughout her tenure as a dentist. She never goes into practice with a male physician or a family member at all. In the 1890s, so that's 1855, 1866, 1890s is really where you see more of a rise in female dentists in the field. More universities and colleges are actually allowing women to attend the colleges. Prior to this, it's not that they didn't want formal training, it's that a lot of schools, one, there weren't a lot of dental schools to begin with, and then the vast majority of them weren't allowing women to even attend. So you have that up through the 1890s, and it's actually during this time period that you have the first female African-American dentist, Ida Gray. She graduates from the University of Michigan College of Dentistry in 1890. You also have during this time period, because you're seeing more female dentists, the creation of the Women's Dental Association, which is founded in 1893. This is mostly back east, where you see kind of more of a concentration. There's more schools there, there's more women being admitted to these schools, so more of them are there. It really only lasts until 1898, where you still see remnants of it in places like Philadelphia. Again, we have a higher concentration of some of those female dentists. It's not until 1921 that you have the Federation of American Women Dentists. It's now the American Association of Women Dentists, so it's still active today. It's still the same organization. And in 1900, so that's about the time when Minnie is going to school, you have about 1,000 women who have followed those first pioneers, Jones, Taylor, and Gray, into the field of dentistry. So this is kind of the time period where Minnie's at, where there are more women. Possibly this is some sort of influence on her, if she's reading any sort of articles on this, to see is this as an option for a career field. So getting into Minnie, here is our Minnie Pinto. So again, she was at St. James when she does her dental career, but that's not where she's born. This photograph of her is actually from about the 1890s, so she would have been in her early 20s, and that's about the time when she first comes to St. James. So going back, giving a little bit of brief history kind of on the life of Minnie, what led her to this career. She originally comes from Ohio, so if anybody knows anything about the history of St. James or Merrimack, little teaser, we'll get into that later. That really plays into why she finds herself in Missouri and in St. James in particular. So she's born in Ross County, Ohio on November 25th, 1870, and she's the fifth of 7 children. She's the 5th child of Miles Augustus and Margaret J. Pinto, nee Reed. And Miles was the son of Captain Isaac Pinto and Maria Marshall. I think Captain Pinto is going to be a whole nother field of research. Very interesting individual. He was born in Portuguese. I wasn't able to find which island in the Caribbean, but one of the ones that the Portuguese held at that time period. He does a lot of, he's a ship's captain, so a lot of trade on the Atlantic, ends up on rivers, and eventually in about 1812, he finds his way somehow inland onto the rivers and on the Ohio River where he did a lot of work, and then up the Scioto, and he buys land in Ross County where he builds a sizable home. Let's see, I've got a map here. So this is actually just a little portion of Ross County, Ohio, and this is where the Pinto family end up. If you see the crazy squiggle lines in between those townships, that's the Scioto River. Again, if you're at all familiar with St. James, the name Scioto is very common. There's a street, there's a park, and then there in those circled areas, those are land owned at this time, so this map is from 1860. At this time it's owned by Samuel Pinto, who's one of the sons of Isaac. So this is Miles's older brother. Eventually Miles and then his son Lawrence, who's Minnie's older brother, ends up owning this land. And if you can tell, that squiggly line again, that's the Scioto. It goes right next to, and in the case of the far northern land, through that. So the family's got quick access to the river, they can travel down, and then if you see the arrow, that arrow actually points to Chillicothe. So it's the largest main city closest to them. They would have had easy access. There's also a railroad line basically kind of paralleling somewhat the river straight into Chillicothe from their land as well. So this probably would have been where they did the majority of their trade. Here's an early kind of postcard depiction of one of the main streets there in Chillicothe. So this would have been where Minnie and her siblings would have been very early on in her life. She would have seen a lot of this. And early on in her life, so again, she's born in 1870, but her mother dies in 1878 when she's only 8 years old. At this time, her oldest sibling, Ernest, he's 18, but the youngest child is only 3. So we have kind of a span of years of kids that are now without their mother. And then a year later, her oldest brother, Ernest, actually ends up taking off at the age of 18 and goes west to Missouri. So he leaves in 1879. So here we have the first Pinto sibling in Missouri. He ends up in Crawford County initially, and then very quickly makes it into St. James. So there's not a lot of information. I reached out to Ross County Historical Society trying to get some information. A lot of what they had was simply on either Captain Isaac or on her brother Lawrence, who does stay in Ohio. Unfortunately, there's not a lot about her father or even kind of some information about some of those early years. But she would have been living with her father on the family land. Probably the brother takes over a lot of that as her father ages. But there are many residents of Ross County, Ohio, who actually make their way to Missouri. So she probably either knows somebody. Again, her brother ends up going there whenever she's not too old, but then also her cousin Harry. But then also most notably is the James family, who are from Chillicothe, Ohio. So the James family, the namesake for St. James, they established themselves in Ohio in 1797, so they're there just prior to the Pinto family. But in 1826, what's important for Missouri is that the patriarch of the family, for at least here in Missouri, Thomas James, establishes the Merrimack Iron Works in 1826, which was this huge booming operation for the 50 so years that it operated. But the important thing is for all of their skilled labor that they needed for the ironworks, that they needed for the settlement, they mostly drew from back east, and a lot of those were from their community back in Ross County, Ohio. So they were calling back. One of those happened to be Minnie's cousin, Harry. So Harry was about 6 years older than her oldest brother, Ernest. And he comes and works for the Merrimack Ironworks. And then, so she already has some family that's here in Missouri, so that's probably the draw for her. And at the age of 18, in 1891, she comes to live with her brother, who's now married at this time period, but she very soon ends up living with her sister, who's also made it here, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And here's actually a really great picture showing the train depot and kind of the early streets. So here, bisecting that was going to be Jefferson, and along here you've got Washington and Washington Springfield streets. So this probably would have been what she saw as she arrived in town. We're not clear on how she traveled. She very easily could have traveled by boat down the Scioto to the Ohio to St. Louis, and then by train. The railroad makes it through St. James and Phelps County in the 1860, 1861 time period. So it would have been here well ahead of her. Or she could have come completely by train at that time period. With kind of the ship's captain legacy and her family, I kind of wonder if there wasn't some river travel in there initially as well. So, like I said, her brother Ernest is here, her older sister Elsie. Elsie's about 2 years older than her. She actually came here in about 1886. I was able to find mentions of her in the newspaper as far back as that. And then she also has 2 other brothers that eventually at different time periods come and join the business venture that her older brother has. So Horace and Rollin also come here. So St. James itself, as I mentioned, railroad comes through in 1860, but the town itself really builds up initially in reaction to the Merrimack Ironworks. They're right on the railroad tracks, so any sort of equipment moving back and forth between the ironworks or St. James, you have to have business, you have to have settlement. But then when the ironworks goes bankrupt in 1876, that's when St. James really starts to flourish. A lot of business people move all of their concerns to right along the railroad tracks, as we see with a lot of towns. I know there's some in southwest Missouri, I'm thinking of Greenfield in particular, that you now have a South Greenfield because the railroad went south of town, so everything diverts and moves towards the railroad. And it was the same for St. James. And that's really one of the big draws for her brother Ernest. So cousin Harry comes and is working for the Merrimack Ironworks, but by the time Ernest gets here, the ironworks are really kind of defunct. So he comes here and he works for a variety of different businesses, some of them the mercantile businesses, before opening his own in the city of St. James. So he followed Harry, and then by the time he gets here, he marries Laura Bowman, who is the daughter of one of the known city founders for St. James. He was one of the early people to have moved there. He marries her in April of 1882. And she dies relatively young. She's only in her 50s when she dies in February of 1918, and then he remarries again that year in June to Julia Pinto. I find it interesting, in newspaper articles they refer to her as a distant relative. She's Harry's daughter, so this is a first cousin once removed. Not quite distant enough for me, but, just all those Pintos from back in Ohio, surely they're not that closely related. Okay. And then just to show just the sheer interconnectedness of a small town, at different time periods, Ernest works as a managing partner for the Dunmore Stock Farm. He does that kind of in the 1890s, and he's in partnership with his brother-in-law, so the Bowman family. To note, Dunmore is the name of the family home for the James family. So again, you have that connection back to the James family yet again. But throughout his kind of life in St. James, he works as a merchant. He has his own mercantile business. He goes into a broader mercantile business with his brothers, and Rollin actually ends up owning and operating a store in Newburgh that, again, they collaborated with. And then he works as a land manager, a bank president, and he's also a presiding county judge for Phelps County. So being, the diligent researcher on this, just finding what information I could, I saw, kind of perks in my mind the fact that Laura died in 1918. I immediately think, well, did she die of influenza? I know I had done research on this previously and hadn't found a lot of cases in Phelps County of either people being sick or even having a lot of deaths for that. So I was curious, and if you'll indulge me, this is a little bit of me being an archivist and having a teaching moment. But I found her death certificate, which you can find Missouri death certificates through the Missouri State Office, Secretary of State. They have them on there from 1910 up through 1970, I believe now, if I'm correct. So here's her death certificate, and they have just wonderful information, her parents, where her parents were born, where she was born, her birth date. Sometimes they'll even have occupation. She was a housewife. They'll have how long she was ill, and then the date of her death, and then her cause of her death. So if I zoom in on that, I don't know how well you can read that. Any guesses on any of the words? I have looked at a lot of these, and a lot with terrible handwriting. And then I gave them to my coworker who worked for herself as a professional genealogist for a number of years. We were coming up with different stuff. I sent this to my mom, who's a registered nurse, who has been deciphering doctor's handwriting for years, and we all came up with different things. We could make out certain words. We could, oh, that's not what I got at all. That's not what I'm seeing. The interesting part is it's a brother-in-law who's the presiding physician on this, who's writing out her death certificate. The big clue on this, and I can thank John Dugan from the Missouri State Archives for this, is that number, the 39 right there in the center. So there's what's called the International Classification of Diseases code number. And those come out, and they change randomly through the years, but you can actually look these up online, and they have kind of an index for what these codes are. So she did die of cancer of the buccal cavity. So that's going to be mouth, throat cancer, which is interesting because then I was able to kind of corroborate that in newspaper articles. Her obituary, it just says she dies of cancer. It looks like in 1915, 1916, prior to her death, she had undergone at least 2 surgeries. I have to wonder if it's not due to this cancer. But again, couldn't make out the writing to save my life. Not that it was the biggest deal in the world, but it's just one of those things that doing research, you just need to know that cause or something. Here's kind of a workaround to at least get some of that information out of your primary sources. So, thank you for indulging me. So, back, we have this really great photo. So this is Ernest. You can see there at the counter, and this is the inside of his mercantile or general store there in St. James. I wasn't able to find where exactly he was located. In the Sanborn maps, they just have them listed as mercantile or general stores. They don't have proprietors or anything. And there were multiple ones. A lot of them along Jefferson Street, along Washington, but there were some further out on like Hardy and Merrimack as well. So I have to assume he would have been on one of the major thoroughfares simply because he was there for so long and was such a prominent member of the community. It's possible that it moved around throughout the community as well. So as I mentioned before, he does serve as the presiding county judge. He's the president of the Bank of St. James. He actually takes over that position from his father-in-law / cousin when Harry's health begins to fail in the 1920s. And then, as you'll see with a lot of the Pinto families, he's just an active member of the community. He serves as the Phelps County Fair superintendent. He actually has quite an influence in the horticulture and agriculture aspects of that. He himself presents at the fair quite often, and he wins prizes, but he also serves as one of the superintendents and kind of one of the overarching organizers of that event. And then he's buried along with other members of the Pinto family. He dies in the 1940s, so after Minnie does, but buried in the family cemetery there in St. James. And in newspaper articles, at one time, he's said to have had the nicest, grandest home in town on Hardy Street. From the house number I was able to find, it's no longer standing. It's kind of over on just west of Jefferson Street there on Hardy. That's now where a lot of kind of 1970s era homes are, although there are still a number of older homes along Hardy Street there as well. So initially, Minnie lived with her brother Ernest, possibly in this grand, wonderful home. But she very quickly, I find her by the 1900 census and even in earlier newspaper articles that she's with her sister Elsie. So here's some images of her sister Elsie. That bottom one's actually taken at Merrimack Iron Works. So again, this is after it's no longer in operation and it's already bankrupt. But even early on, it was already kind of a tourist attraction. People would go to fish, they would picnic, they would wade, they would swim at the river as well. So she's just a little bit, about 2 years older than Minnie. And I found her in newspaper articles as early as 1885, I believe. So most likely here living with her older brother Ernest and his wife. And it had to have been somewhere around here that she actually meets Dr. Charles H. Fulbright. So Charles was initially from Laclede County, but the two of them met here, and then they married in 1889 whenever he had just graduated with his medical degree. He'd actually done an apprenticeship with a doctor down in Lebanon, but they ended up settling here in St. James. And then in, let's see, I'll get this year right. So yeah, 1890, the couple unfortunately delivered a stillborn child in February of 1890. And then that very next year in 1891 is when Minnie actually comes out to live. It could be she's coming to visit because her sister has suffered this loss. Her sister's also pregnant again in 1891 and delivers a child in early 1892. So maybe that's why she moved in with a couple to help with her sister's pregnancy. Unfortunately, this child also dies young, only living about 5 months. So again, this could explain why she's living with her sister rather than her brother and sister-in-law. And that child that was 5 months old, they had named after her, Minnie Fulbright. So you do find her in the Fulbright family plot in the cemetery there. But they do have a daughter, Mary Laura, in 1894, and she does survive to childhood. So Minnie would have been there to see the birth of her niece. And then the couple adopts a young girl named Dolly. I have found her name a few different ways. In the records, she shows up as Rubusky. I've seen it as Rinker. She also later goes by Fulbright, obviously once she's been adopted. And then in Elsie's obituary, she shows up as Stolman. So I have to assume that's probably her married name by that time period simply because of her age. So something else kind of to note, the little pieces of connection of a small town. In this top photograph, Elsie's the second from the right, and then the third lady there is Mrs. Towle. So Mrs. Towle is married to Dr. Towle, who actually the Pinto and Towle family actually intermarry as well. And Dr. Towle was also a dentist. So again, you kind of have that family connection, maybe some sort of influence. Minnie would have definitely had contact with Dr. Towle at some point. Maybe that's the influence that leads her to a dental career. So the Fulbright family, here's an image of Dr. Charles Fulbright, and then the little cameo is of Dolly. So these are just members of Minnie's family that she would have been living with. Initially, the family's over on Park Street there in St. James, but in about 1920, just prior to Elsie's death, the Fulbrights build this home, which is located on Eldon and Seymour, and it's actually still standing in St. James. So this is where they lived. So Minnie's life in St. James, she was really popular. I find her in a lot of newspaper records, attending parties and soirees. She's invited to different events, Thanksgiving parties. I really like this bottom one. She is awarded a bouquet, which was voted the most popular lady in St. James. So you kind of find this throughout her 20s, the 1890s up to 1900, all of these active social life. She's a member of the Methodist Church. So there's a lot of instances where she's referenced there, doing different works or events through the church. She ends up becoming a member of the Order of the Eastern Star as well. She does attend some classes over at Salem. I have to assume at the Salem Academy. It kind of fits with the time period. So this is when she first gets to town. So I don't know if she moved here at the age of 18 and hadn't finished her coursework when she was in Ohio while she stayed here, or did she need some more coursework just before she entered into dental school. So that was never really clarified, but she did finish up some of those classes. So in about 1898, 1899, when she's about the age of 30, she goes to attend dental school. I find this comment, this particular quote, kind of interesting. Deciding upon a professional career. It's how she's described in her obituary when they talk about her becoming a dentist. It's like, this is the choice she made, either because she had no other choices or she chose not to, I assume, get married. Because quite often during this time period, if a woman marries, she's not going to have a career. Unless, I guess, she had married a fellow dentist, which we saw with some of the earlier women. But she goes to school. So the school that she attends is Marion Sims Beaumont. There was a lot of consolidation of this school very early in its history. It really doesn't last as Marion Sims for very long, which, again, this is another research. Marion Sims, the doctor that this is named after, kind of an atrocious man, but a very interesting research topic that I almost thought, no, bring it back. I have to focus on what we've got here. But he really didn't have anything to do with the dental school. So the dental school starts in about 1894, 1896 for different parts of it. It was continuously building kind of during this time period and opening more and more. It had a nursing program, it had the dental program, but the dental program really started in 94. So the course instruction for both the dental and the medical college initially was 3 years, but about 1899 it bumps it up to 4 years. So Minnie was kind of right there on that cusp of, she had either 3 or 4 years of schooling here because she graduates in 1901. And in total, in the 10 years of its existence as Marion Sims, it graduated about 596 physicians from the medical department and then 56 from the dental department. So Minnie was one of the only 56 dentists to graduate from Marion Sims. The dental college does continue. It ends up being absorbed into the St. Louis University kind of medical college. And in 1905, when that's all consolidated, women are no longer allowed to attend the dental school. And that doesn't change for St. Louis University until after World War II. So during the time of World War II, it was one of only 5 colleges in the nation that didn't allow women. There was a few other back east, Harvard being one of them, but I just found it interesting that she kind of just squeaked in there just soon enough to be able to get it. Otherwise, she would have had to have gone either Kansas City or even out of state. And there was actually a number of out-of-state students, even females, that attended this school as well. So she was actually the second woman to graduate from Marion Sims. The first was a St. Louis native. There was also, as I mentioned, some from out of country, so there was a lady from Canada that even came down to attend school here. So at the time when she was attending, the first graduate had already passed through. So she went through all of her coursework alone. She was the only female in any of these classes. There were her final year of school 4 incoming women as freshmen. So there was some younger classmen that she would at least been able to see while at the college, but they didn't share any coursework for that. For the most part, most of these women would return to their hometowns, similar to Minnie, to practice. Some of them just being native to St. Louis, obviously either settled into their neighborhood. A few of them did travel to others. There was, I believe, one young lady from West Plains, also from Missouri, not from St. Louis, that attended this school. So as I mentioned, she graduates in April of 1901. I bring up this article in the newspaper because I just found it interesting. The president addressing the graduating class, and he mentions that, and he emphasized the fact that on graduating, a man's life study had but commenced, and that success and high standing in the profession are only attained, and goes on. But there's absolutely no mention to the fact that there is a female graduating. He currently has 4 females enrolled at that time period. She is listed in the list of graduates for that year, but no mention whatsoever of female graduates. So Minnie, as of 1901, comes back to St. James and sets up her practice. As I mentioned, she goes solo for the entire time. I have not found any indication that she teamed up with a fellow dentist, male or female, at any time period. So initially, I find newspaper articles, kind of advertisements for her dental practice as early as July in St. James. Initially, she's located over the Gowans drugstore and then eventually the Wright's drugstore. So I don't know if this is a change of location, if it's the same drugstore, new ownership, that sort of thing. But she has her own office, and she focuses on crowns and a porcelain crown and bridge work were kind of her specialties. And I have to assume there were other dentists in town, but I assume that she was kind of the big draw for, again, female and children patients at this time period. So this is a really great photograph. Again, this is Minnie sitting up there, and then that's Dr. Fulbright, so her brother-in-law, and this is actually in his office practice. At one time, they share space over the Wright's drugstore. He has his medical practice, and then her dental practice is on the other side as well. So I thought this was a really great photograph, kind of showing her in the cusp of her career. And that little weird machine thing is actual electroshock therapy machine, which is the first brand new to be brought into St. James. Dr. Fulbright, actually, I found him in a lot of newspaper and kind of court records where he's often the testifying physician on like insanity, mental disability cases. He's kind of the one signing off on that. So apparently mental diseases was his thing, was something he was very interested in. And apparently electroshock therapy also as well. So, no thank you. I will note, so if you look at the newspaper article there towards the bottom, this notes in 1911 land for sale. So at least one time period, Minnie's a landowner. She's got 80 acres and a 7-room house. So she's not doing bad for herself. I don't know why she sells. I don't know if she ever lived on this property, if she rented it, if she inherited it. But at least at one point she does have quite significant land. I will note on there, something you'll see often, even though she's a doctor, she's still listed as Mrs. Minnie Pinto. Every once in a while, I'll find her in the St. James paper in some article listed as doctor. In any of the advertisements she pays for, obviously she's there, but never in the Rolla Herald do I see her as Dr. Minnie Pinto. She's always Miss Minnie Pinto, even later in her career. So there's other local dentists actually in town. One of them, Dr. Owsley, that should be kind of a common, well-known name. He's the husband of Dr. Mamie Owsley. She was the first female mayor in Missouri, and I think in the United States as well, elected there. But there's also Dr. Wart, so he's in Rolla, but he quite often has a regular day that he spends in St. James seeing patients. The same with Dr. Zawicki. I was never able to find where his home base was, but he had Thursdays in the commercial hotel. He had a space there that was kind of reserved for him on those days where he saw patients. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the Dr. Tao. He really comes at the end of her career, right when she's retiring, and settles in St. James. The Dr. Tao house is actually still standing there in town. So she would go on to continue to serve the St. James community for over 30 years. She had her practice, again, on her own, always living with her sister and brother-in-law. She did have that property, but I never found evidence that she actually lived there, so it could have just been a very temporary situation, or it could have just been land that she owned. So on into later years, towards the end of her life, as I mentioned earlier, in the 1920s, the family moves to this house on Eldon and Seymour Street. During this time, the home was actually used for a time as the Bethesda Sanitarium, so I wonder if that wasn't part of, I know it's part of Dr. Fulbright's practice, but also this, with those listed as insane, maybe they needed to be admitted to a hospital. Oh, hey, I have a hospital where they could be admitted. I don't know that, but you kind of wonder if that's not the correlation there. So this would have been the life that she had. She would have had this sanitarium, probably in the lower quarters of the home as well, would have been part of her life as well. And this other photograph, and I'll talk a little bit more about this, is actually Dr. Fulbright at the Soldiers' Home, so the Missouri Veterans Home now. And he was the presiding surgeon for the Veterans Home for a number of years. Also in the 1920s, she loses her sister Elsie. So Elsie dies in 1923 and is buried near her two young children that die very young. And something to note on this that is a little bit of a recurring instance is she dies from chronic nephritis. So that's kidney failure. It can be a family hereditary trait of just having kidney issues. But in 1924, so she loses her sister in 1923. In 1924, they lose Harry, her cousin Harry, and his wife Kate, both from chronic nephritis. So another cause of chronic nephritis is also toxin. So that I've never been able to determine. They are not the only members of the family. Ernest, who dies in 1941, also dies from chronic nephritis, and then Dr. Fulbright, who dies later in the 1940s, has acute nephritis. So there's just an awful lot of kidney failure for not everybody who's related. So I don't know. The ironworks were just down the road. Who knows what was leaching into the river where they fished, swam, probably drank the water. If that could have been the cause, I don't know. It's something that makes me kind of want to start looking through more early death certificates for citizens of St. James, but that would be quite the undertaking. And a whole nother project. But again, you see this sense of community, involvement. So these are some of the articles from when Elsie passes away. She was very well known over at the Soldiers' Home where her husband was the surgeon. And actually there, towards the end of her life in early March 1923, Minnie does start taking some time away from her dental office, probably to help care for her sisters. There's several articles where it talks about how she's been ill for several weeks leading up to her passing. But again, there's like a list of everything that her sister is involved with within the community. So this Pinto family is very invested in the St. James community, and they're very active members. So Dr. Charles Fulbright. So again, another very active member of the community. He's actually appointed the local surgeon for the Frisco that's coming through in 1917. He's the health commissioner for Phelps County on multiple occasions. I think the earliest one I found was in 1909 and then on later. But then he's very active with the Soldiers' Home. So what I find interesting and kind of wonder about is for a time period here, you had kind of a very balanced number of men and women at the Soldiers' Home, because here early on, wives and widows were allowed to live at the Soldiers' Home as well. So I kind of wonder if Minnie didn't provide dental services for the wives and widows that were at the Soldiers' Home as well. The Soldiers' Home itself had started in 1897, so just prior to her becoming a dentist, and then he is serving actually as the surgeon as late as 1938, so kind of all through her tenure as a dentist, he would have been active there. So here we can see, and this was the first indication that I saw right here. When I found her death certificate, I was like, wait a minute, wait, are we confused? No, she actually does marry Dr. Fulbright, so she marries her brother-in-law. Again, it's not the first cousin once removed, but so they get married actually in 1930. So in about late 1920s, early 1930s, Dr. Fulbright, he's in his early 60s at that point, had started wintering down in Arizona as a retirement, and it appears Minnie traveled with him on a number of occasions after his wife's death. And in one of those occasions, in December of 1930, the two of them get married while down there. Again, we're starting to go straight into the Great Depression. Minnie has just hit 60 years old. He's now 65. Is it companionship? Is it financial? They were still living in the same household in 1930 that I found, so I wasn't really sure. But at that time period, even it could have been that she wanted to retire, because she does retire after her marriage and then just becomes an active member of the community. But then, upon her death in July of 1936, she doesn't die from chronic nephritis. About the only member of the family who doesn't. She gets this full kind of column obituary, front page, first column of the St. James Journal, which none of her other family members do, but she's right up there. And they actually, again, had this kind of she was a lovely person to the thousands in and about St. James, was a noble, kindly soul, full of sympathy and understanding that endeared her to all that came into contact with her. So you saw those very early ones when she's, this beautiful young lady where she's super popular, and she seems to have maintained that connection with the community and that kind of adoration from the community throughout her life as well. So she served as a dentist for 29, almost 30 years in the community of St. James. And then a little bit to just bring it all back, she's buried in the St. James Cemetery. She is directly next to Charles, which makes for a little confusion. Elsie's on the other side of the family plot. But just kind of to bring it back full circle, if you look at this photograph from the St. James Cemetery, if you look off to the left, that's Minnie and Charles's stone right there. Elsie's is just a little bit further to the right. And then if you look to the back to the left, that's the Pinto family plot. So they are literally the very first row of the city cemetery, where you see a lot of the founding and prominent members of the community. The Bowmans are up there, the Tennikes are up there, but then if you look off into the far right, where that obelisk is, and then kind of the arched doorway, that's the James family plot. So again, very big, well-known family. Mostly it's cenotaphs in there. The majority of the James family is actually buried back in Ohio. Lucy Wortham James is buried in New York, although there are cenotaphs to all of her pets, and they are listed on there. There's kind of some funny names. I'm like, who named their child? Oh no, that was your dog. Excellent. This is a person I can like. So after serving, her community for over 30 years, I think it's just fitting that she is there amongst some of these city founders and some of these early prominent family members that really settled St. James and made it what it was. And with that, I'll open up for questions if anybody's got any.
What did she die of?
So she, from myocarditis, so an inflammation of the heart. Yeah. She, that's usually caused by bacterial infection that causes heart inflammation.
In one of the early slides, Charles's first wife,
Yes.
her sister,
Mhm.
it lists her brother as a surgeon in 1915.
Yes.
How many medical people were in the Pinto family?
There were some medical. That's a really great question. So, his first wife Elsie, her older sister. So one of their siblings, he goes mostly by AS, is what I find a lot of him as. He's a medical doctor. He's the only other doctor in the family that I know of. I think there were some of the next generation also joined the medical field as well. But he has a medical practice in Omaha, Nebraska. And that's where Laura, so the sister-in-law, she actually travels to Nebraska, and that's where she has her surgery, I assume related to her cancer. And at that time period had positive results, according to the newspapers, when she made it back. Yes?
An observation first. This is an era when if you're a female and you want a professional career, it's either going to be elementary school teacher or nurse.
Yes.
So she's distinctive in
Yes.
that regard. But a couple of questions about her practice. Is there any evidence that she or any other dentist had a dental assistant, or did when you went in to see them as a dentist, they did everything?
Right. I never found any indication of dental assistance, which you would almost think that, as a female dentist, maybe she'd be an assistant, but from what I can tell, she was on her own, looking through, because I did scan through just the St. James census records and never saw anyone listed in anything that I would think would kind of fit to that dental assistant field. Yeah.
And the second question has to do, you mentioned that she had a specialty in crowns and bridges. You had an ad for a male dentist.
Yes.
That was his specialty also. So
Yes.
my question is, So dentists of this era are responding to problems
Mhm.
only, or is there any preventive dental care going on?
Right, yeah.
Like a regular checkup and teeth
Yeah.
cleaning, that kind of thing.
And it's really interesting, kind of as a side note, you see during this era when you have more women working as dentists, again, they're focusing on women, they're focusing on children. So this is where you start seeing the rise of pediatric dentistry. So again, a little bit more of the preventative care. And you certainly see more of that as more education comes. It's not just pulling teeth, fixing problems. But you do see more of them specializing, and I have to assume that's to stand out a bit more. This is what we can be done. But yeah, you do start seeing slowly more and more of that kind of preventative care mindset towards dental work, not just come to me when you have a toothache kind of a thing.
Another observation, if I may.
Okay, yes.
You mentioned the Marion Sims Dental School.
Yes.
Medical school.
Yes.
And she's one of the last females, it's circa 19, what,
She graduated in '01. There were 4 female students just below her, but I wasn't able to determine if they graduated or not. They would have, because they would have been in that 4 years, they could have graduated by '05. But there was kind of the big turnover for the school,
And then no more.
and then no more until after World War II.
So what was striking to me is, 1907,
Mm-hmm.
the director of this campus stood up before his board of trustees and said, finally, we have no more female students.
Oh, that's right.
We are true school of mines and metallurgy.
Yes.
I wonder if that same mindset,
If it was just kind
Came
of
over.
across
Yeah,
the board in
the
a lot of
professional
things.
schools.
Yeah. Yeah.
interesting, yeah, thank
So
you.
it's not just mining schools that are
Okay,
exiting out.
thank you.
At this time, yeah, it was the medical one. So yeah, it would be interesting to look more at, maybe check out, yeah, UMKC, what were they doing in the medical and the dental schools over there at that same time
Yeah.
period? Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes.
Do we have any indication that she attended dental conferences or did any kind of
So
advanced work?
I did look, because again, that Association for Women Dentists starts up in 1921, so this would kind of been towards the later years of her career, but I wasn't able to find whether she was involved or invested in that. I don't really find a lot for the association further west. Again, a lot of that's back east in kind of those earlier years in some of the bigger cities. I do find them in Chicago at later times, but I wasn't able to determine. It wasn't in any of the listing of the multiple things she was associated with in her obituary or anything. Yeah.
And, okay, I'm seeing a way that her and Charles could be working a scam.
Oh, now we have a scam going. Okay.
He's got the electroshock.
Yes.
Does he have the mouth block?
Does he have the?
No.
No.
They're chomping down. She's replacing their bridge work.
Yes. You now have cracked teeth? Here, I have a great dentist you could go to.
A cynical people.
Just
I know,
stop.
you are a little cynical. You do some of this historic research, you get a little cynical sometimes,
Yeah.
unfortunately. Yes.
One other thing, oh, I'm sorry, I've asked 3.
Oh,
Could you
yeah.
talk a little bit about what dental work was actually like during her?
Yeah. So,
I have a personal interest in this, which I'll share with you
oh,
afterwards.
what? I wonder if we're gonna have more dental horror stories.
Yes.
You know, since the first, it's not you're going to the barbershop to get it, a tooth yanked out or anything like that. But it's still pretty primitive. Some of the anesthesia and the anesthetizing that they have is kind of risky in the stuff that they use, so sometimes it's not used. Because you would see chloroform in some of these earlier instances, and then some of the technology, again, you're not going to have x-rays or anything like that to really get in there to look to see at that. So some of the implements and the instruments are still pretty rare. Again, you have porcelain for the crowns, so some of the stuff that they're using to even fill teeth or to, you're not having dentures really at this time period. It's really starting to evolve, and I don't know how up to date Minnie stayed in her practice, so it could just be this is what I learned in 1901, and this is what she continued with throughout her career, or if she tried to stay up to date in some of those medical advances.
Well, I asked because my grandfather was a dentist,
Oh.
and he went to Kansas City for
Okay.
dental school. He would have started practicing in the 30s. He was born in 1900. And having had him clean my teeth once,
That was enough.
it was incredibly painful.
Oh, yeah.
And his speed drill, there is no such thing as a speed drill.
No.
I mean, it was as slow as what they use to jet water into your mouth after a cleaning. That,
Yeah.
you know how slow that is?
Yeah. Because early on, you wouldn't have any sort of electric tools, so if there had to be anything like that, it
would have been hand.
It would all have been done by hand.
Yeah.
As electricity comes and more of these invention
I mean,
torture devices
He
come
did
into
have an
existence.
electric drill, but it was
Right.
not very fast.
Yeah, it's like, we're going to be here for days
Yeah.
working on some of this. Yeah.
And he didn't believe in Novocaine.
Well, no. I mean, why would you need Novocaine? Oh. Bless.
So since she specialized in porcelain
Yeah.
and crown work, did she make it herself? I mean, how did, in the industry at the time, most dentists, I believe, were making their own crowns.
Yes.
Mhm.
My grandmother did.
Yeah. So that would be my assumption too, is
Okay,
that's what she
alright.
did as well. Yeah.
Which then would kind of make that stand out as a, I mean, that would be a true specialty.
Right.
Because not everyone would have
Mhm.
had the talent to do that.
Right, yeah, no, for sure. You want that to be something that fits and,
Right.
and operates well. So if she's using that as her specialty, she's gotta know that she can do that well, so that gets around the community like, hey, she is good at that. Yes.
And what was her degree, DDS or?
Yes,
Okay.
yeah, she was a DDS.
You remarked a couple times that her patients were female and children.
Primarily, from what I've been able to find, yeah.
Well, that reminded me, talk about your grandfather. I remember my grandfather going to a physician
Mm-hmm.
when I was just a child. He came home storming that he was a woman. He wouldn't go to a female physician. Was there a resistance of men going to a female dentist?
I think
Is that why?
yeah, I think it's just the time period of men didn't want to go to female, and that's why the women quite often took over the women and the children, because women didn't feel comfortable going to a male doctor, whereas they could go to a female. And the same with the kids. Apparently they found the women more calming. I do have an anecdote, I don't know if John's on here, but he can remember Dr. Owsley, one of the other dentists in town, when he would work on a patient, he'd always have a big old cigar stuck in the corner of his mouth. And he'd switch it to the other side whenever he had to, so, it was always on the side away from you. So, I could see that being very off-putting for, well, anyone, but, a female especially. I mean, just please, sir. So, I don't know how often that occurred in his practice, but there was at least a few people that remembered that occasion happening. Yeah. So I have no stories of Minnie smoking her cigar while working on patients. So.
Maybe he was just chewing.
Right? Could go either way, but yeah, it just, I found that one particular. I do have kind of a line out on a Pinto descendant that I'm hoping to be able to make contact with. She's still there in St. James, so hopefully we can get some more family information, stories about Minnie herself. But.
Well, and if she did extractions, that takes a fair amount of muscle power.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that would, it's, how tall was she? Was she a big woman?
All I have
Okay.
are photographs of her, but she seems, I believe I've got one of her standing next to Dr. Fulbright, and she's at least as tall as him, but,
Is it listed on her death report?
it's not on her death certificate, but I wonder if I can go back and find, he would have had to have done the old man's registration for World War II, because he would still been alive during that time period, and that should have his height. So I might be able to estimate her height. But still, you've got a squirming child that you're trying to remove a tooth from. Yeah, it takes a little bit of muscle, especially at that time period when you don't have a lot of tools needed. And
Particularly for an impacted wisdom tooth.
yeah.
That takes an awful
No, I had 8 removed when I was 11, so I could get braces. So I remember the yanking. Oh, this will be fine. You're gonna need to strap me to the chair for this kind of a thing, because yeah, it took some doing. Man, everyone's just gonna go home with nightmares about dentists.
Well, but you can see why people would have that view of dentistry, because they don't go for preventive care.
Right.
You only go when there's a problem.
When it's really severe is when you're seeing the dentist, and then it's
And it's a balancing of the pain I have versus the pain I'm going to go through to get rid of the pain I have.
Exactly. Like which one is worse? And you finally get to that point of like, okay, anything's got to be better than this. And sometimes that's true. Sometimes it's not.
Okay, well,
Thanks
thank you
so
so
much.
much.
Thanks you all. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, so join us next week, again at 5:30. We'll be hearing from Dr. Larry Gray, Emeritus History Professor on this campus, about the challenges women faced on this particular campus early on. And you heard him allude to that a little earlier in one of his questions. Thank you very much.
Katie White, really extraordinary research. That was terrific. Newspapers, death
It takes forever to read
certificates.
newspapers.
The only thing missing was letter collection.
I was wondering, I mean, there's no record from
No letter
her
collection?
practice or.
That would have been cool.
And
Yeah.
that's the thing I hadn't even, I heard about